Frontiers and boundaries of a state explained for a 10-year-old. Imagine a state or a country as a big playground. Every playground needs rules about where one ends and another begins. That's what frontiers and boundaries are all about. Let's break it down. What is a frontier? A frontier is like a zone or area between two playgrounds. It's not a clear line, but more of a fuzzy space where people from both sides might meet. Frontiers are often wide and can include forests, deserts, or mountains. For example, between some countries, there's a big desert or jungle, acting as the frontier zone. Frontiers are like the space where two playgrounds don't have fences, but still know they are separate. What is a boundary? A boundary is like the chalk line or fence marking the exact edge of the playground. It tells everyone, this is where one side ends and the other side begins. Boundary line. This is an exact line, like a fence, wall, or river. For example, rivers and mountains often act as boundaries. Boundaries are more specific than frontiers. They're like a sharp line instead of a blurry space. How boundaries are formed. Countries don't just draw boundaries randomly. They have to agree or decide on them in different ways. 1. Purchase. One country buys land from another. Example, the U.S. bought Louisiana in 1803 and Alaska in 1867. 2. Arbitral award. Sometimes, when two countries argue about a boundary, a third party, like a referee, helps decide. 3. Plebiscite or referendum. People living in an area vote to decide which country they want to join. 4. Treaties or agreements. Countries sign agreements to settle their boundaries. Example, the India-Bangladesh Water Treaty deals with river boundaries. Functions of boundaries. Boundaries do more than just divide land. They have important jobs, like 1. Defensive barrier. Protects a country from attacks, like a strong wall. 2. Political barrier. Keeps governments separate, like two principals managing their own schools. 3. Social barrier. Separates people with different languages, religions, or cultures. 4. Economic barrier. Controls trade, like deciding who can sell or buy things across the border. Different types of boundaries. 1. Natural boundaries. These use rivers, mountains, or deserts to divide land. Example, the Himalayas separate India and China. 2. Geometrical boundaries. These are straight lines drawn on a map, like using a ruler. Example, the boundaries of Libya, Sudan, and Egypt in Africa. 3. Cultural boundaries. These separate people based on culture, language, or religion. Example, India and Pakistan were divided partly because of religion. 4. Relict boundaries. These are old boundaries that aren't used anymore but still visible. Example, the boundary that once separated East and West Germany. Examples of boundaries. 1. U.S.-Canada boundary. A peaceful boundary, marked by agreements like the Lake Commission of 1946. 2. Truce line or ceasefire line, a temporary line agreed upon during conflicts. Example, the line of control between India and Pakistan. 3. Physiographic boundaries. Boundaries that follow natural features like rivers or mountain ridges. Example, the crest or summit line of a mountain range. Why are boundaries important? Without boundaries, there could be fights over land, like two kids arguing over the same part of a playground. Boundaries help keep things organized and peaceful, whether they're natural, like rivers, or man-made, like fences or lines on a map. Would you like me to explain anything further? 2. What does land allocation mean? Land allocation is the process of dividing or assigning land among different countries, regions, or groups. It often happens during the creation of international boundaries or during disputes when land needs to be shared or redistributed fairly. 3. What does the demarcation process mean? The demarcation process is when the boundary between two areas is marked clearly on the ground using physical markers like fences, walls, or boundary stones. It's the practical step after deciding on a boundary through treaties or agreements. 4. What is the boundary marking process? The boundary marking process is similar to demarcation, but focuses more on the physical marking of the agreed boundary. This includes erecting pillars, placing signs, or setting natural markers like rivers or mountains as visible borders. 5. What is meant by the political barrier function of the border? The political barrier function of a border is to separate the governments and political systems of two countries. For example, the border between India and Pakistan ensures that the laws and governments of each country operate independently. 6. What is the cultural boundary? A cultural boundary separates people based on cultural differences, such as language, religion, or ethnicity. For example, the boundary between India and Pakistan was influenced by religious differences between Hindus and Muslims. Define the previous boundary. A previous or relict boundary is an old boundary that no longer serves its original purpose but can still be seen. For example, the boundary between East and West Germany still has visible remnants even though it no longer divides the country. 8. What do you mean by the next frontier? The next frontier refers to an undefined or unexplored zone between two territories. Unlike a fixed boundary, it's a vague area where both sides may claim some control but haven't clearly marked the limits. Section C. Essay questions. 9. Define boundary and describe its characteristics. A boundary is a defined line or limit that separates two territories, countries, or regions. Characteristics of a boundary include 1. Definiteness. It marks a specific location. 2. Immutability. Once agreed upon, it doesn't change easily. 3. Functionality. It serves purposes like defense, economic control, or cultural separation. 4 types. Boundaries can be natural, like rivers, or man-made, like fences. 10. What is meant by borders and borders? State the difference. Borders, broad areas or zones near the edge of a country, often acting as a buffer. Boundaries, precise lines that mark the separation between two territories. Difference, a border is a wide zone, while a boundary is a narrow line. Borders allow interaction between two regions, while boundaries often restrict or control movement. Discuss the process of land allocation and demarcation. The land allocation process involves 1. Surveying, studying the area to be divided. 2. Negotiation. Countries discuss and agree on the division of land. 3. Treaty. A formal agreement is signed. 4. Demarcation. The land is physically marked with signs or pillars. Example, the Radcliffe Line between India and Pakistan was created using this process. 12. Discuss the boundary setting process. The process includes 1. Definition. Boundaries are defined in maps or agreements. 2. Delimitation. Boundaries are mapped out with specific coordinates. 3. Demarcation. Physical markers are placed on the ground. 4. Administration. Border control is set up to enforce the boundary. State borders and boundaries. 13. Stages of formation of international boundaries and land demarcation. 1. Exploration, identifying the area to be divided. 2. Negotiation, deciding the boundary through treaties. 3. Delimitation, mapping the boundary. 4. Demarcation, physically marking the boundary. 5. Maintenance, regularly checking and maintaining boundary markers. 14. Define boundary and discuss its functions. A boundary is a dividing line between two territories. Functions. 1. Defensive, protects against invasion. 2. Economic, controls trade and resource extraction. 3. Social, separates communities with different cultures. 4. Political, defines the area of government control. #15. Functions of international borders and protective barrier functions. Borders serve these functions. 1. Protection, prevents illegal crossings. 2. Trade regulation, controls goods moving between countries. 3. Cultural separation, preserves cultural identities. Protective barriers include walls, e.g. the Great Wall of China, or natural. 2. What does land allocation mean? Land allocation is the process of dividing or assigning land among different countries, regions, or groups. Question 16. Classification of land boundaries and class of origin. Land boundaries can be classified based on their origin and how they were established. 1. Natural boundaries, formed by physical features like mountains, rivers, or deserts. Example, the Himalayas separating India and China. 2. Geometric boundaries. These are straight lines drawn on maps, often without considering natural features. Example, the U.S.-Canada boundary along the 49th parallel. 3. Cultural boundaries, based on cultural differences like language, religion, or ethnicity. Example, the partition of India and Pakistan due to religious differences. 4. Historical boundaries, created based on historical claims or treaties. Example, the Treaty of Tordesillas dividing territories between Spain and Portugal. 17. Morphological classification of boundaries and cultural boundaries. Morphological boundaries are classified based on their shape or structure. 1. Physiographic boundaries follow natural features like rivers, mountain ridges, or valleys. Example, the Rhine River as a boundary between France and Germany. 2. Geometric boundaries, straight-line boundaries drawn using latitude and longitude. Example, the border between Egypt and Sudan. Cultural boundaries. These separate people based on cultural factors like language, religion, or traditions. Example, the boundary between Belgium's French-speaking Walloons and Dutch-speaking Flemish populations. Mattern 18. Geological boundaries and mountain ranges. Geological boundaries. Formed by natural geological features, often mountain ranges, which act as barriers between regions. Mountain ranges serve as strong natural barriers, protecting regions from invasion and influencing weather and culture. Example, the Andes Mountains forming the boundary between Chile and Argentina. 19. Natural boundaries and river boundaries. Natural boundaries, created by natural landforms like rivers, lakes, mountains, and deserts. River boundaries. Rivers often serve as dividing lines between countries or regions. Example, the Rio Grande River between the U.S. and Mexico. Advantages. Rivers are easy to identify. Disadvantages. Rivers may change course over time, leading to disputes. 20. Natural boundaries and lake boundaries. Lake boundaries. Large lakes can also act as natural boundaries, dividing countries or regions. Example, the Great Lakes between the U.S. and Canada. Natural boundaries like lakes are stable, but may require shared agreements for resource use and environmental protection. 21. International boundary problems and solutions. Problems. 1. Disputes over land, conflicts over who owns a particular territory. Example, the Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan. 2. Migration and illegal crossings. Unregulated movement of people can cause tensions. Example, the U.S.-Mexico border. 3. Resource conflicts. Disputes over shared resources like rivers, oil fields, or forests. Example, the Nile River dispute involving Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Solutions. 1. Treaties. Formal agreements between countries to resolve disputes peacefully. Example, the India-Bangladesh Land Boundary Agreement in 2015. 2. Boundary commissions. Joint efforts to demarcate and maintain boundaries. Example, the U.S.-Canada International Boundary Commission. 3. Mediation. Neutral third-party nations or organizations help resolve disputes. Example, UN mediation in the Israel-Palestine conflict. 22. Importance of state borders and boundaries. Borders and boundaries are crucial for maintaining order, security, and sovereignty. They, 1. Prevent conflicts. Clearly defined borders reduce disputes over land. 2. Regulate trade and movement. Borders help control immigration and the flow of goods. 3. Preserve cultural identity. Boundaries allow regions to maintain distinct cultural practices. 4. Resource management. They define access to natural resources like water, oil, or minerals. For example, the U.S.-Canada border is one of the longest peaceful boundaries in the world, facilitating trade and cooperation between the two countries.